and welcome to module number 4 of the course, The Effect of Aging on Real Estate, Stock Returns, and Interest Rates. My name is Manuel Buchman. I am the Research Director of the WDA Forum. I am a Swiss economist focusing on the effects of demographic change on the economy. And I currently lead a research project of the WDA Forum called Financial Demography, where we analyze the effects of demographic change all around the world on financial markets. In this module, we will be talking about first, income, consumption, and saving over the life cycle. This is the baseline connection or link between financial markets, and demography. In that lesson, I will also develop some hypotheses on what effects in terms of interest rate changes, in terms of stock returns, and in terms of real estate markets we will expect from the current trends in demography. And then in the following lessons, I will go into more depth. I will first in lesson 2 talk about expected effects of demographic change on stock returns and then on interest rates. In lesson 3, I will talk about the living situation and home ownership over the life cycle, or in other words, how does population aging affect the demand for real estate and therefore real estate markets and real estate returns. And I will close this module in lesson 4 with a topic that is very important to us in terms of where should we place this topic demography when we talk about financial markets and risks in financial markets. And we believe that demography should be part of the S in ESG, the social, and I will go more in depth into what this means and what should be done in terms of this ESG and demography. I will now start with lesson 1, income, consumption, and saving over the life cycle. First, the motivation. Why do we even talk about the life cycle? This to me is the core of this whole topic, the link between demography and financial markets, which is exactly this life cycle of income and consumption. So how does income change over the life cycle, and how does consumption change over the life cycle? This very directly affects how much is saved at what age, how much is invested at what age, and this in turn affects financial markets. This is extremely important right now because behavior in terms of saving and investment changes drastically between the ages 50 to 64, 65 to 79, and then again ages 80 plus. So it is really important to separate these age groups, especially also concerning the current demographic transition, where a very large cohort is moving from age group 50 to 64 into age group 65 to 79, also known as the baby boomers. This is extremely important to understand long-term developments on financial markets. If one understands demography and how the life cycle, behavior of the life cycle changes, one also understands what big trends will happen on financial markets in the coming years and decades. I start with the basic income profile over the life cycle. What you see here is how income changes, income on the y-axis, over the age of a typical individual in a developed nation. So on the x-axis, you see the age, on the y-axis, you see income, and how does income change over the life cycle. We start at age 0, we basically have 0 income. This remains very low and starts increasing around age 20 once the typical individual starts entering the labor market. Here, income starts increasing rapidly and consistently up to around age 45 to 55, which is generally the highest productivity. At this age, we earn the most, we are the most productive. And then income slowly starts decreasing once people move into retirement or early retirement. This decrease first happens slowly and then more and more rapidly. The typical retirement age around the world is around 65. Some countries it's earlier, some countries it's later. But once we enter retirement, income decreases again and slowly moves towards zero again at the end of the life cycle. This is a typical profile in developed nations, as calculated by the project NTA, which stands for National Transfer Accounts. In developing nations, this looks a bit different. Developing nations, one starts working earlier and also does not stop working at age 65, but keeps working roughly until the end of life. Now, this is the income. Here you can see the same profile for consumption. And as you can already see, this is not hump-shaped anymore, but more or less increasing with age. So now on the y-axis consumption, on the x-axis still age. Important to understand here is that this is not necessarily consumption that I myself will pay for, but consumption I cause in terms of I go to school and my parents pay for the school. This is consumption for me, not consumption for my parents. So again, consumption is very low at the beginning, but starts increasing rapidly with education. So schooling reaches a peak around ages 15 to 18, then slowly decreases again once education is completed. And then consumption remains fairly low between ages 20 to 50. This is not because we spend less, but we spend less on ourselves. What we spend the money for at this age is our children. So this hump shape on the left side, education, a lot of that is paid for by the parents, of course. Then at roughly around age 50, children become independent. Parents don't have to pay for the children anymore. And what happens is parents will now start spending more on themselves. So consumption increases again up to around age 65. And then consumption does not decrease with retirement. And this is interesting. This is not something that is generally known, but once we retire, we don't consume less. We maybe consume a bit differently. Maybe we consume a bit more healthcare, maybe a bit less sports, but generally consumption remains high between ages 65 to 80. And then at age 80, consumption increases again. And this is the age with the highest consumption overall. And of course, this is mainly healthcare expenditure, be it from hospitals, from retirement homes, etc. So consumption is highest at age 80 plus. Now we combine these two curves. Again, on the left side, on the y-axis, you can see now income and consumption, and on the x-axis, age. So these curves overlap. Now we see some areas where one line is a lot higher than the other. So for example, between ages 0 and roughly 30, consumption is much higher than income. And as I mentioned before, much of this deficit is financed by the parents because between ages 30 and 50, income is much higher than consumption, but the parents spend all of this surplus on education, on average, of course. And then between ages 50 and 65, income is still higher than consumption, but now there are no children anymore to pay for. So what we see here at this age, 50 to 65, is a lot of saving and a lot of investing. This is also the age where retirement is on the horizon, where retirement is something very real that is coming very soon, something to prepare for. So people in this age have a lot of incentives to save a lot of their income. As I mentioned before, consumption also increases, but income is still much higher than consumption. And then around age 65, it flips around. So income goes down and consumption keeps increasing. And now we have a big deficit. And this deficit is financed mainly through two ways. One way is this saving of the savings that we made between ages 50 and 65. We start consuming these savings. And of course, through social safety nets. So transfers from the working age population to the retired population. And it is these last two colored boxes, saving and investing, and the saving and social safety nets, that are really the core of our interest here. What you can see here is a table for various regions in the world. How many savers are there? So ages 50 to 64. And how many savers are there? Ages 65 plus. These numbers are all in millions. And I highlight for you these 2 years, 2020 and 2035, because these are really central. This is the big change that is happening right now with the retirement of baby boomers. Today, we have roughly 250 million savers and 250 million savers, more or less, in the developed countries. So this includes Europe, this includes North America, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. Then, 15 years from now, 2035, we still have roughly the same amount of savers, 5 million less, but drastically more savers. So this is an increase of over 60 million savers. This is the big change. So baby boomers changing from being savers to being savers. If you look at China, things are even more extreme. Today, there are 300 million savers in China and 172 million savers. So almost twice as many savers as savers. And in 2035, there will be the same amount of savers and savers. This change is indescribably fast. And China, of course, we don't talk about the baby boomer generation, baby boomer cohort. What's really the burning point in China is the one-child policy that led to very low fertility very suddenly. So there's a much smaller cohort following the currently retiring cohort. If we look at the rest of the world, we also see aging. We see in India today 177 million savers, 91 million savers. We see mainly a growth. Particularly, we see many more savers, but also more savers. Effects will be different in India. There is not this big shift from saving to saving yet, but it is on the horizon if you have a longer perspective. Same in Africa. In Africa, what we see here is really it's only starting now that we see savers in the first place. So every 15 years, we see an increase of around 30 million, and now between 2020 to 2035, an increase of 70 million savers. And if we look further into the future, another 100 million savers. So this is really starting to take off in Africa. We don't talk about the saving issue yet. This is very much into the future. The remainder of this lecture, of this module, will focus on the developed countries, the retirement of the baby boomers, but we'll also at some points talk about China. What does this big shift in China have to do with financial markets in developed countries? I close this first lesson with a preview of the following lessons. In terms of this very simple table here, with what we have seen now in the past few slides, the life cycle changes and the demographic changes that are happening, what do we expect to happen in the coming decade, the coming 2 decades on the financial markets? Important to me is I always talk about the effect of demography on different markets. I do not talk about total effects, aggregate effects. I talk about just the effect of demography, which I am sure is significant. But of course, there are always effects that are running in other directions. What we have seen in the past 20 years on the stock markets is a very large positive effect of demography, because as we have seen, baby boomers have been in this age where they save and invest a lot. So there has been a lot of demand from baby boomers for stocks in anticipation of their own retirement. This should have had a significant positive effect on the demand for stocks and therefore also stock returns. Now, if you look at the future, as these baby boomers are moving into a dis-saving age, they should start selling their stocks, or at least stop buying stocks because they don't have to save anymore, they don't have any labor income anymore. So we should expect a decrease in the demand for stocks in general, as baby boomers start consuming their own private savings, but also start dissolving their retirement funds. In terms of real interest rates, we have seen a very strong negative effect the past 20 years, because there has been a lot of savings from baby boomers again, which depresses the return on capital or interest rates. I will go into more detail here in future lessons. And in the future, next decade, it's really not clear what will happen. We have some countervailing effects of demography and interest rates. There are good arguments for increasing interest rates, as we observe right now on the markets, but also very good arguments for negative interest rates or negative effects on interest rates. Finally, the real estate markets are a bit more clear again. We have seen a very high demand for real estate from baby boomers investing into their housing. And we should expect a decrease in the demand for real estate as some economies start shrinking. And as baby boomers start selling their homes because they move into retirement homes. This is a bit more of a long-term aspect, but as soon as this is anticipated by markets, we ought to see effects on real estate returns. It's a preview on what is to come in the following lessons. with this, I close lesson number 1 and see you again soon for lesson number 2. Thank you very much.